in using this in front of a web server. Of course, ideally, the translator and the web server would be running on the same machine. They'd just be different processes. But initially, we didn't test that. And here's a graph of the results. And this is one of those meaningless graphs that scientists like to put up because you can't see any data in it. But realistically, here's a statistical plot. The boxes that are really small are 95% of the data. On the left, you have the website as it serves pages normally. There's no translator, direct from website to client. 95% of the stuff was in that box. These are times. The basic proxy is the same thing, but it's not translating anything. It's just copying the pages from the server and sending them on to the client. If you have a proxy server, it does exactly the same thing. So there's a performance hit between having a proxy server and just going right to the source. The third and final element on the right is the translation server with all of these features implemented. It's not much slower than an actual proxy server, a plain old proxy server. So the big overhead here seems to be in the way the proxy was implemented. And the seconds on the left, they're all tolerable. In a larger data set with different types of data, you'd see load times that skyrocket way off the top of the chart. So this is a cumulative distribution graph of the same data. This is the same data. The faster a chart climbs, the better it is, because it means that most of the data is between where it's plotted and to the left. So for example, on this hump right here, about 15% of the data for no translation at all direct to the web server was here or faster. And it goes on. So the idea is you want these all as close to the big, thick red line that didn't do any translation as possible. The overhead difference between a proxy server and a translator is very minimal. And the fact that the lines are vertical shows that the data is cohesive and it's all representing about the same data. Well, remember I had mentioned how it would be ideal to put the web server and the translator on the same machine? That was step 2 of our experiment, and we tried that, and we went from this cumulative distribution plot to this one. Now there is practically no overhead whatsoever. This is in a really fast implemented, or very quickly implemented prototype in Java. So I believe wholeheartedly that the overheads can be almost entirely eliminated as maybe an Apache module or something like that. So it works, and there's barely any overhead. It's not noticeable for sure. But there are other things to consider, of course. The user agent has to be forwarded in case the real web server does something with it. Cookies have to be forwarded in case the real web server sets or receives cookies. There's optimizations you can do. Since the person who deploys the server is probably the same person who wrote the website initially, you can speed up the translation by not searching through each web page. You can make template web pages that say, put pseudonym here, put pseudonym here, put pseudonym here. That'll speed things up. I used regular expressions, which aren't the fastest thing in the world. If you had a template, it'd be pretty fast. So I've talked about the problem, the obvious browser sniffing problem that if you weren't afraid of before, I hope you'll be wary about now. I told you about a few solutions that were implemented, specifically the one that we implemented and how it can be just plugged in between a service and clients. And I showed how our quick prototype proves that it's quite fast. And if you have any questions about this, I'd love to hear them. So, sure.
I'll jump in and ask. It occurs to me that unless you have an encrypted connection, certainly it's possible to pick up some of the pseudonyms along the way.
Sure.
And that would allow someone to use the pseudonym for the capture. But there's also the issue, we see a lot of spyware.
Right.
That hasn't, to my knowledge, been integrated with phishing attacks much. But that would seem to be an effective workaround for these protections if I had spyware in my browser that was also reporting this information back. Have you thought about that at all?
Oh, you bet. So the question was, there's the possibility that there's spyware or hijackware already on a person's computer. So it can pick off the pseudonyms right from the browser without having to worry about it. And we have thought about that. This problem doesn't protect people from malware. This problem only protects people from phishing attacks that are HTML and web-based, and specifically this browser recon attack. But it's completely right. If there's spyware on a person's machine, they're pretty screwed. That's my opinion right there.
Windows users.
We won't get into that argument, but yes. Any other questions? Sure.
I heard you talk about putting the cookies on a person's computer, or maybe putting pseudonyms and cookies. I believe. I don't know if I'm on the right track here, but is that the way you implemented it, or? I mean, how would it be implemented? Because if you're putting cookies on a person's computer, there's still a big chance of grabbing information from the person's computer at that point.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand your question right. The question was that I said something about implementing this using cookies. How does that affect the security of it? And because they can just be sniffed out of JavaScript.
Exactly.
Okay. Cookies can be used to verify whether or not a pseudonym is old. So what I had in mind was not to use cookies instead of putting the pseudonym in the URL. What I had in mind was when you set the pseudonym, you also set a cookie with the same value. Next time somebody comes to your website and doesn't have a pseudonym, or maybe a time has expired, you look to see if they have a cookie. If they do, and it's an old pseudonym, and it's the same pseudonym that they're using, you know for sure that it's stale. So you'd have to use the cookies with a time limit to basically expire old pseudonyms, but you can't use them instead of the URL problem. I don't know if that helps answer your question. You can't use them alone to verify a pseudonym, that's for sure.
Okay. No, the reason I was asking is because cookies have usually a session ID associated with them, and there's issues with if the attacker can get access to that certain session ID, they might be able to do certain things with a client computer. So one way around them is you can actually do cookieless sessions. You can write your own protocol or something like that, but it's just something I had in mind because it seems like a cool idea, but try to eliminate the client out of it in one way or another, and cookies is always
going to talk about
remain on
that
the
more.
client.
I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Okay.
One thing to note as well, this doesn't work if there's a man in the middle at all, because they can just strip it right off. But I haven't seen any in the wild phishing attacks that are man in the middle. Yet. I shouldn't say I won't. Yet. That's also harder to pull off a man in the middle. Any other questions? Got another one?
Yeah. There are many organizations that have installed border proxies that are used for several reasons. Security is part of it, but also simply for bandwidth assistance or for filtering prohibited content. It would seem to me that if you're able to compromise in some way at that proxy, or actually, if the request originates from the proxy itself, that's where the pseudonym would be for the proxy, not at the merchant's proxy, but at the client's proxy. So, for instance, if I had a squid proxy for Purdue, would the pseudonym be attached to the proxy or to the client behind the proxy?
Well,
would there be any way of doing it?
Okay. I think the confusion here is with the URLs as they go through that client-side proxy. I think they would just go right through. If your squid proxy was compromised, it would effectively be a man in the middle between the client behind the proxy and my server. So I kind of think of that as the same problem.
Well, in part, I guess what I'm thinking here is that if the pseudonyms transited the proxy without alteration, then it would effectively reduce the effectiveness of the proxy for caching,